Part 1. The Ghost. In the kingdom of Ethermere, every soul was born twinned. A human heart, thinking and cautious, shared its body with a wolf spirit, a creature of instinct and need that lived behind the ribs like a second pulse. The wolves were not metaphors, they were real. They dreamed inside their hosts, they yearned, they snarled, and in moments of great emotion, they could surge to the surface and reshape flesh and bone into fur and fang. A shift was not a transformation. It was a revelation. The wolf had always been there, and the human body was simply the door it walked through. The wolves divided their people into 3 castes, as old as the first forest. Alphas were dominance and command. Their wolves burned hot, possessive, and territorial, radiating a pheromonal authority that could buckle knees and bend wills. Betas were the steady middle, their wolves calm, adaptable, the backbone of every pack and province. And Omegas were the rarest. Their wolves were creatures of deep feeling, empaths, nurturers, healers of the spirit. An Omega's scent could soothe a raging alpha. An Omega's distress could shatter one. And then there was the bond, the mate bond. It was not a choice. It was a recognition, wolf to wolf, across any distance, through any crowd. When 2 wolves that were made for each other drew close, something ancient stirred. The alpha's wolf would know first, because alpha wolves were always reaching outward, always searching. But the bond did not seal until the Omega's wolf answered, until it surfaced from whatever depth it hid in and reached back. Only then did the cord of light snap taut between them, a connection that was biological, magical, and irrevocable. The mate bond was the holiest law of Ethermere. It could not be commanded into existence. It could not be faked. And to violate it, to force a bond, to abuse a bonded mate, was the one sin for which there was no pardon. But like all holy things, it had been corrupted. There were those who saw Omegas not as sacred partners, but as assets. Fathers who auctioned their Omega children to the highest bidding alpha. Alphas who mistook the bond's pull for ownership. Wolves who believed that because destiny had paired them, consent was implied. Sarah knew. She had lived it. The Royal Library of Ethermere was a fortress of silence, and Sarah was its ghost. She moved between the towering shelves of vellum and leather, a wraith in a simple gray dress, her soft-soled slippers making no sound on the cool marble floors. Here, the only demands were the quiet pleas of forgotten histories and the patient weight of dust. Here, she could breathe. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper, ink, and beeswax polish, a holy trinity of peace. It was a scent that coated the back of her throat, a welcome balm that smothered the phantom stench of stale wine and violent rage that sometimes clung to her memories. For 6 years, this had been her world. A world she had meticulously constructed from silence and solitude. Her wolf, the small, trembling Omega within, was a creature she kept locked in a cage of her own making. Not iron bars. Ice. She had frozen it there herself, layer by careful layer, because a surfaced Omega wolf was a beacon. It broadcast scent, need, vulnerability. It called to alphas the way a wound calls to wolves in the wild. And Sarah had learned, in blood and bruises, what happened when an alpha answered that call. So the wolf stayed frozen. Its soft whines and desperate need for comfort had dimmed over the years to a dull ache behind her ribs, barely distinguishable from hunger or cold. To feel was to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable was to be a target. She did not feel. She did not hope. And she never, ever smiled. A smile was a beacon. It was an invitation. It was a crack in the armor, and hers had been forged in fires she would not revisit. Her face was a placid mask, her eyes downcast, her presence so negligible that courtiers often walked past her without a second glance. She was the librarian, a fixture, as inanimate as the stone griffins guarding the entrance. This was how she survived. The intrusion, when it came, was not a shout or a command, but a scent. It sliced through the comforting dustiness of her sanctuary like a winter wind. Pine and frost and something else. Something primal and dominant that made the air crackle with a pressure she felt in her teeth. Alpha pheromones. Not the stale, aggressive reek she remembered from her past. This was different. Cleaner. Vast, like standing at the edge of a frozen lake and feeling the immensity of the water beneath the ice. King Dominic. He rarely came to the library. In the 3 months since a border reassignment had moved Sarah from the deep archives to the main collection, where she was now required to attend court sessions and deliver records in person, she had seen him only at a distance. A figure on a throne, a voice giving orders, a silhouette on the training grounds, his wolf a massive black beast with gold-flecked eyes that made the other wolves lower their heads and bare their throats. His presence here was an anomaly, a disruption to the delicate ecosystem of her peace. Every instinct, every scar-etched lesson screamed at her to flee, to make herself smaller, to disappear into the shadows between the shelves. Her body froze, her hand hovering over a rare tome on pre-unification cartography. She could feel the vibration of his footsteps through the floor, a steady, confident rhythm that echoed the beating of a predator's heart. He wasn't looking for a book. Men like him never were. They were always looking for something to conquer, something to control. She forced her lungs to draw a slow, silent breath, schooling her features into the blankness she had perfected. Do not look up. Do not engage. You are a shadow. You are nothing. Librarian! The word was not a shout, but it struck her like a physical blow. A low, resonant bass that vibrated in her bones. And deep behind her ribs, beneath the layers of ice, something stirred. Her wolf. Not a whine this time, but a twitch, like a frozen animal feeling the first distant touch of spring warmth on its fur. Terrified and curious. It was the voice of an alpha in his prime, a voice layered with the harmonic undertone that all dominant wolves carried, the frequency that could compel obedience in lesser wolves. But he wasn't using it as a command. The undertone was leashed, banked. He was speaking to her as a man, not as a king. Slowly, deliberately, she turned. She kept her eyes fixed on the knot of his dark blue tunic just below his throat. To meet an alpha's eyes was a challenge of the old wolf protocols, and she was no challenger. She was a survivor. There was a difference. Your Majesty, she murmured, her voice a reedy whisper, rusted from disuse. I require a text. On the eastern trade routes, the one with the embossed leather cover. His request was simple, mundane, yet his scent was anything but. It was rolling off him in waves, a heady, intoxicating mix that spoke of dominance and a strange, focused intensity. And there was something else beneath it, a warmth, almost a sweetness, that she had never encountered in an alpha's scent before. In the language of wolves, where scent was more honest than words, it was the smell of yearning. Careful, restrained yearning. It was all aimed at her. She felt like a mouse pinned by the gaze of a hawk. Why? She gave a short, jerky nod and led the way, her spine rigid. She was acutely aware of him behind her, of the sheer size and power of him. He walked with a preternatural grace for a man so large, his steps nearly silent now, as if he were stalking her. The hair on her arms stood on end. The primitive part of her brain screamed, danger. She found the book on a high shelf, its dark green spine faded with age. Reaching for the rolling ladder, she tried to keep her hands from trembling. Allow me, he said. His voice was closer now, directly behind her. Before she could protest, a large, warm hand settled on the small of her back, a brief, shocking point of contact that sent a jolt of pure fire through her. Not pain, something worse. Recognition. Her wolf lunged against its cage of ice, and for one terrifying second, a crack spidered through the frozen wall. She flinched violently, stumbling forward and catching herself on the shelf, the books rattling in protest. The touch was gone as quickly as it had come, but the brand of it remained, searing her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird beating its wings against a cage. No, 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 no. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The library, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. The walls were closing in. "My apologies," King Dominic said, his voice softer now, and his scent shifted, the dominance pulling back, replaced by something gentler. In wolf terms, he was deliberately dampening his pheromones, making himself smaller. An alpha, voluntarily reducing his presence for her comfort. She had never experienced that before. "I did not mean to startle you." He reached over her head, his body caging hers against the shelves for a breathless second. His scent was overwhelming, a forest after a snowstorm, clean and sharp and utterly male. He retrieved the book with ease, his bicep brushing against her temple. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the wave of dizziness that threatened to pull her under. When she opened them, he had stepped back, putting a respectable distance between them. The book was in his hand. But he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at her. She risked a glance at his face, just for a second. His eyes, the color of molten gold, the mark of a royal-blooded alpha, the wolf's fire burning close to the surface, were fixed on her with an unnerving focus. There was no anger there, no predatory gleam she was so used to seeing in the eyes of alphas. There was something else, a question, a searching, and beneath it, a flicker of pain, as if her flinch had hurt him more than any blade. She hated it. She hated being seen. She quickly lowered her gaze, clutching her hands together to stop their shaking. "Will that be all, Your Majesty?" "For now," he said, the words hanging in the air between them. He didn't leave. He just stood there, his presence a warm, steady weight. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken things. It was a different kind of silence than the library's usual comfort. This one was alive, electric. She could feel his wolf at the edges of his control, not pushing, not demanding, but waiting. The way a wolf waits at the mouth of a den where something frightened has hidden, patient and still, refusing to leave. Finally, with a soft sigh that sounded strangely like disappointment, he turned and walked away. The oppressive weight of his presence lifted, and Sarah could finally breathe again, leaning her forehead against the cool, solid wood of the bookshelf. Her wolf was pacing now, restless and confused, circling inside its cage. The ice had cracked where his touch had landed, and through that crack, a thin tendril of warmth was leaking in. The wolf pressed its nose to the fissure, breathing in the lingering scent of pine and frost. Sarah ruthlessly patched the crack. She rebuilt the wall, layer by frozen layer, with practiced hands. The mate bond was a fairy tale, told to omegas to make them compliant, to make them believe their chains were spun from destiny. She knew better. She knew they were forged of iron and pain. Her wolf had once reached for a bond with the alpha her father had sold her to. It had opened itself, trusting and hopeful, and he had used that connection like a leash, yanking her wolf to heel, flooding the bond with dominance until she couldn't tell her own feelings from his commands. Never again. The king was just another alpha, and she was just a ghost. She would remain so. It was the only way to be safe. Part 2. The Fool. The incidents began a week later. They were small at first, easily dismissed as accidents. A dropped stack of papers during a council meeting she was attending to deliver records. A misspoken word in a formal address that twisted a solemn decree into something faintly ridiculous. Sarah noticed them because it was her job to notice things, to be an observer from the shadows. She cataloged them as oddities, nothing more. But then came the cape. It was a full court session. The throne room was a dizzying kaleidoscope of color and sound, filled with scented nobles in their silks and velvets, every alpha and omega broadcasting their status through pheromones. The room a complex tapestry of dominance and deference that made Sarah's suppressed wolf want to curl into a ball. She stood near the back, a silent pillar of gray, waiting to present the quarterly household ledgers. King Dominic was on his throne, a formidable figure in his ceremonial robes of deep crimson, the high wolf crest, a crowned wolf howling at a crescent moon, embroidered in gold thread across his chest. He looked every inch the powerful, unassailable monarch he was. His alpha pheromones filled the room like a low, constant hum, and every wolf in attendance, from the proudest beta lord to the most decorated alpha general, instinctively lowered their shoulders in his presence. He rose to address a visiting dignitary. He took 2 steps down from the dais, his voice booming with regal authority. And then, his boot seemed to catch on the hem of his own ridiculously long cape. He didn't fall, not completely, but he stumbled, lurching forward with a muffled curse, arms windmilling for a comical moment before he caught his balance. A collective gasp rippled through the court, followed by a shocked, indrawn breath of silence. The king stumbled. In a society where an alpha's physical grace was a direct reflection of his wolf's power, a stumble was almost as shocking as a defeat in combat. His guards rushed forward, but he waved them off, a flush creeping up his neck. He straightened his robes, cleared his throat, and continued his address as if nothing had happened. But the spell of absolute, intimidating power had been broken. For a single, absurd moment, the terrifying Alpha King had looked like a clumsy boy who had yet to grow into his own feet. And against every wall she had ever built, against every ounce of her self-control, Sarah felt it. A tiny upward pull at the corner of her mouth. It was a ghost of a movement, a muscular twitch so small that no one could have possibly seen it. But he did. Across the vast, crowded throne room, his golden eyes lifted and met hers. Just for a second. And in that second, she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before in an alpha's gaze. It wasn't command, or possession, or lust. It was triumph. A fierce, wild, blazing triumph. As if that clumsy, undignified stumble had been the most calculated victory of his entire reign. The realization sent a sliver of ice down her spine. The twitch on her lips vanished, replaced by the cold, familiar mask of nothingness. She looked away, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud of dread. It wasn't an accident. None of it was. And a terrifying, impossible thought began to take root in the barren soil of her mind. He was doing it for her. The king, it turned out, was a relentless fool. Sarah tried to avoid him. She changed her delivery routes, took her meager meals in the kitchens instead of the staff hall, and buried herself so deep in the library's archives that she half hoped to fossilize there. But he was the sun, and she was a small, stubborn planet caught in his orbit. He was inescapable. 2 days after the Cape incident, she was summoned to the breakfast chamber to deliver an urgent message from the rookery. She had planned to slip in, place the scroll in the hand of his aide, Lord Sirius, and vanish. She found the king engaged in a new and deeply baffling hobby: juggling. He was standing by the buffet table, tossing 3 green apples in a wobbly, precarious arc. One of the apples had a bite taken out of it. The nobles at the high table were pretending with all their might that their monarch was not behaving like a court jester before he'd even had his morning tea. Lord Sirius looked as though he was chewing on wasps, his face a mask of pained dignity. Dominic was not a natural juggler. An apple flew wide, and he lunged for it, knocking over a pitcher of cream. Another bounced off his forehead with a dull thud. He grunted, but kept going, a look of absurd concentration on his face. His alpha pheromones, usually so controlled and commanding, had gone haywire, spiking with bursts of childlike glee that were so at odds with his status that the wolves of every noble in the room were doing confused double takes. Sarah froze in the doorway, the scroll clutched in her hand. It was the most ridiculous thing she had ever seen. A king, whose hands were trained to wield a sword and sign treaties, was fumbling with fruit like a common performer. And he was so bad at it. The sheer, unkingly incompetence of it was bizarrely compelling. A sound, a tiny choked puff of air, escaped her lips. It was almost a laugh. She clapped a hand over her mouth, horrified. His eyes, sharp and bright, immediately found hers. A slow grin spread across his face, a genuine, breathtakingly handsome grin that transformed the stern angles of his jaw and made something behind her ribs flutter with a feeling she refused to name. He winked, a deliberate conspiratorial gesture, and promptly lost control of all 3 apples. They rained down around him, one landing with a splash in a bowl of porridge. And in the wreckage of fruit and spilled cream, his scent reached her across the room. Not dominance, not command. Joy. Pure, unfiltered, boyish joy. It was the scent of an alpha who was genuinely, deeply happy. And it was so foreign to everything she associated with that caste that her wolf pressed against the ice wall in confusion, drawn to the warmth like a moth to flame. Sarah didn't wait to see more. She practically threw the scroll at a startled Sirius and fled, her cheeks burning with a heat that had nothing to do with shame, and everything to do with a strange, terrifying warmth spreading through her chest. The absurdity escalated. A week later, she was shelving books near a window overlooking the royal menagerie when she heard raised voices. One was the king's. The other was a high-pitched, squawking shriek. Peeking through the leaded glass, she saw Dominic, dressed down in a simple tunic and breeches, standing before the large, ornate cage of Captain Squawk, the ancient and famously foul-mouthed palace parrot. "I am your king," Dominic declared, pointing a stern finger at the bird. "And I command you to say, 'Your Majesty is the wisest of all rulers.'" Captain Squawk ruffled his vibrant green feathers, cocked his head, and screeched, "Sirius has a hairy back! Squawk! Pieces of 8! "That is slander against a trusted advisor," Dominic shot back, looking genuinely offended. "And it's thematically inconsistent. We are not pirates." "Traitor! Wench! Give us a cracker!" the parrot squawked, hopping from one foot to the other. "You will address me with the proper respect," Dominic insisted, his voice rising in mock fury. "Or there will be consequences. I'll replace your sunflower seeds with millet, the cheap kind." Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her body trembling with the effort of holding back the laughter that was building inside her like a physical pressure. An alpha king, a shifter of immense power whose wolf could flatten a war horse, was in a shouting match with a bird. Over millet. The sheer, unadulterated silliness of it was chipping away at her defenses, grain by painful grain. She watched until her sides ached with suppressed mirth, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful. And with each suppressed laugh, she felt a tiny shard of ice loosen from the cage around her wolf. Her wolf, dormant for so long, was awake now. It wasn't frightened of the king anymore. It was entertained. It peered out from behind her eyes, head tilted in canine curiosity, watching the big, loud, silly alpha who argued with birds and couldn't juggle. For the first time in 6 years, her wolf wasn't pressing itself flat against the ground in submission. It was sitting up, ears perked, watching. But it was the following Tuesday that shook her most deeply. She was crossing the great hall to deliver a ledger when she saw it happen. A visiting baron, a thick-necked alpha with too much wine in him and not enough sense, had backed a servant against a column. The servant was a young beta woman, her eyes wide, her scent sour with fear. The baron had his hand on her arm, his grip too tight, his laughter too loud. "Come now," the baron slurred. "Just a dance. What's the harm?" Sarah had frozen. The scene was a mirror, reflecting something she knew in her bones. Her chest tightened, her vision narrowed. And then the king was there. He didn't announce himself. He simply appeared at the baron's shoulder, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. His scent hit the hall like a wall, not the playful, goofy warmth she had been growing accustomed to, but something ancient and terrible. Dominance in its purest form. The scent of an alpha whose wolf was not playing, was not performing, was not making anyone laugh. The scent of a predator that had identified a threat to its territory. His eyes blazed gold, not the warm amber of his human gaze, but the flat, burning gold of a wolf on the edge of shifting. A low growl vibrated from his chest, subsonic, felt more than heard. Every wolf in the room flattened. The Baron released the servant's arm as if it had burned him, his face going white. "You will remove your hand," Dominic said, and his voice was layered with the full harmonic force of an alpha command, the frequency that bypassed the thinking brain and spoke directly to the wolf inside. It was not a request, it was gravity. "You will apologize, and you will leave my court before I let my wolf decide how to handle you." The Baron stammered, bowed, and fled. Dominic stood rigid for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his chest heaving. Sarah could see it, the battle. His wolf wanted more. It wanted to chase, to punish, to tear. The pheromones rolling off him were almost unbearable, a storm of protective rage that made her knees want to buckle. She watched his jaw clench, watched the gold slowly drain from his eyes, watched his hands uncurl finger by finger. She watched him choose. He turned, and his gaze found hers across the hall. For one raw, unguarded second, she saw the beast behind his eyes, vast and furious and barely leashed. And then he blinked, and it was gone, replaced by something softer, something almost apologetic, as if he was embarrassed that she had seen the predator and not the fool. But Sarah wasn't frightened. For the first time, she understood. The fool and the predator were the same man. He had the power to crush, and he chose to juggle. He had the instinct to dominate, and he chose to make her laugh. The restraint wasn't weakness. It was the most profound strength she had ever witnessed. That night, alone in her small room above the library, her wolf did something it had not done in 6 years. It pressed against the walls of its ice cage, not in panic, not in submission, but in longing. A soft, tentative whine that resonated in Sarah's chest like a note struck on a forgotten instrument. Him. It wants him. She pressed her fist to her sternum and wept, silently, not from fear, but from the terrifying realization that the ice was thinning from the inside. The final straw in her carefully constructed dam of misery came in the form of puppies. Lord Sirius had cornered her in a corridor, his expression grim. Sirius was a beta, steady, unflappable, the kind of man whose wolf probably balanced ledgers in its sleep. But today his wolf was agitated. She could smell it, a sharp, worried tang beneath his usual calm. "Miss Sarah, a word." Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She was being dismissed. She had been noticed too much. "My lord?" "The king has been unwell," Sirius said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "His behavior is erratic. He trips, he fumbles, he converses with fowl. We, his advisors, are deeply concerned. We fear some madness has taken him." He paused, fixing her with a shrewd look. "I have noticed that his episodes seem to occur with unusual frequency when you are present, or nearby." The implication hung in the air. He wasn't asking for her counsel. He was suspicious. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. I am just a librarian, my lord. I have done nothing to—" "I am not accusing you," Sirius said, though his eyes said otherwise. "I am merely observing a pattern." He sighed, looking ancient and weary. "He has requested your presence in the West Garden, to consult on the placement of a new sundial." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. A sundial. Her stomach twisted with dread. She couldn't refuse a royal summons. She walked to the West Garden as if to her own execution. The sun was warm, the roses were in full bloom, but all she felt was a cold knot of anxiety. She found him not by a sundial, but on a lawn, surrounded. The castle's prize wolfhound bitch had recently had a litter. 10 fluffy, clumsy, oversized pups whose own tiny wolves had not yet awakened. That would come at adolescence, the first stirring, when their human and wolf spirits would meet for the first time. For now, they were simply puppies. Joyful, chaotic, drooling puppies. And they were currently swarming their king. He was sitting on the grass, and they were everywhere. They chewed on his boots, tugged on his sleeves, and climbed his broad chest to lick his face with joyous, slobbery tongues. His alpha pheromones had gone completely soft, the wolf equivalent of a grown man making baby noises. a warm, nurturing scent that she had never smelled from an alpha before. It was the scent wolves used with pups, the scent of protection without possession. "Help!" he yelped, though he was laughing. "I am beset by vicious beasts! A king's guard to my aid! They are relentless! Oh, the savagery!" He flopped onto his back, and the puppies took it as a signal for an all-out assault, piling on top of him in a wriggling, yipping mound of fur. All Sarah could see was a hand waving weakly from the puppy pile. "Avenge me!" he cried, his voice muffled by fur and glee. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, watching the most powerful man in the kingdom being utterly defeated by 10 pounds of fluff. The alpha who could flatten a baron with a glance, the king whose wolf could shift into a beast the size of a draft horse. He wasn't a predator. He wasn't a threat. He was a warm, laughing man covered in puppies, and his scent was the safest thing she had ever smelled. And the dam broke. Not just a crack, but a complete and utter shattering. A sound tore from her throat, a sound she didn't recognize as her own. It was rusty and raw, a gasp that turned into a chuckle, and then into a full, peeling, uninhibited laugh. Laughter. It hurt. It stretched unused muscles in her face and chest. It made tears stream from her eyes. It felt like breaking, like a fever, like a storm that was tearing her apart and washing her clean all at once. She laughed until she couldn't breathe, her hand pressed to her stomach as if to hold herself together. And inside her, the cage shattered. Not melted, shattered, from the inside out. Her wolf, warmed by weeks of stolen laughter and unexpected safety, had grown strong enough to break free. It surged upward, not in panic but in joy, flooding her senses with a rush of feeling so intense she nearly collapsed. Her scent, suppressed for years, bloomed outward like a flower forced open by sudden sun. Chamomile and old parchment, and something deeper, something ancient and omega and unmistakably hers. Through her tear-blurred vision, she saw him. He had emerged from the puppy pile, shooing them away gently. He was on his knees on the grass, his hair disheveled, a smear of dirt on his cheek, and he was watching her, his golden eyes wide with a look of such profound, devastating tenderness that it stole the air from her lungs. He wasn't laughing. He was just watching her, as if her laughter was the most sacred music he had ever heard. The sound died in her throat, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. Because her wolf, now free, now feeling everything for the first time in 6 years, had turned its gaze toward his wolf. And his wolf was already there, waiting, patient as a glacier, warm as a hearth. The bond snapped into place. It was a cord of light, of energy, of pure golden certainty, stretching from his soul to hers. Not a leash, not a chain, a bridge. She could feel him on the other end, not as a command or an invasion, but as a presence. A vast, warm, steady presence that was radiating one single, overwhelming emotion through the bond. Relief. As if he had been holding his breath for months, and she had finally let him exhale. Mate. The word exploded in her mind, not as a thought, but as an absolute, undeniable truth. A biological, magical, spiritual imperative. He was hers. She was his. The laughter died, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. She turned and ran. Part 3. The Bond. She didn't get far. The library was her only destination, her only haven. She burst through the doors, her breath sobbing in her chest, and ran deep into the maze of shelves, finding the darkest, most remote corner she could. She sank to the floor, her back against the comforting solidity of books, and wrapped her arms around her knees. For a wild, desperate moment, she considered leaving. Packing her small bag, slipping out the servants' gate, disappearing into the countryside. She had done it before. 6 years ago, when the alpha her father had sold her to had died in a border skirmish, she had walked for 3 days through frozen woods to reach the capital. She could do it again. She could run. But the bond was a thread of light in her chest, warm and steady, and she realized with a sick lurch that she could feel him through it. Not his thoughts, the bond was too new for that, but his emotions. And what she felt was not pursuit, not the hunting frenzy of an alpha chasing its prey. What she felt was anguish and restraint. A wolf pacing at the boundary of a line it had drawn for itself, desperate to cross, but refusing. He's holding himself back. The realization cracked something in her that the laughter had not. She heard the doors to the library open and close. A single set of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in the vast, silent space. He was coming. Of course he was. But he was moving slowly, giving her time, giving her warning. Through the bond, she felt him dampening his wolf, pulling it back, muting the alpha presence that could have compelled her. The footsteps stopped a few feet from her hiding place. She could smell him, pine and frost, and the faint, earthy scent of grass and puppies. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his presence a solid, warm weight in the cool, dusty air. The silence stretched on, a minute, then two. It wasn't the menacing silence of a predator waiting for its prey to break. It was patient, respectful. He was giving her space. He was letting her breathe. Finally, his voice came, low and soft, stripped of all its royal command, stripped of every harmonic undertone. Just a man's voice, rough with feeling. Sarah. Just her name. It was a question, a plea, an apology, all in one. She couldn't answer. A knot of grief and fear and a desperate, traitorous hope was lodged in her throat. Through the bond, she knew he could feel her terror. And she felt his response, not frustration, not impatience, but a wave of sorrow so deep it made her breath catch. He was sad. He was sad that she was afraid of him. He sank to the floor, his back against the opposite shelf, so they were sitting in the same aisle, hidden from the world, but not quite touching. She heard the soft rustle of his clothes, the quiet sigh he let out. "My wolf saw you," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to soak into the very wood of the shelves. "The first day you appeared in court, 3 months ago. You were delivering a ledger. You were so still, so invisible. But he saw you. He saw your wolf, curled up so tight inside you, hidden behind all that ice, hiding from the world." Sarah trembled, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. "He knew," Dominic continued, his voice thick with emotion. "My beast, this great, roaring, possessive thing inside me, it knew you were ours. And it wanted to roar. It wanted to throw you over its shoulder and carry you off to our den and never let anyone look at you again." A cold dread washed over her. This was what she knew. This was the possessive, controlling nature of an alpha. "But," he said, and the word was heavy with meaning, "for the first time in my life, I told it no." Through the bond, she felt the truth of it, a memory of struggle, of a man wrestling his own nature into submission, not for power, for her. "I looked at you, at the terror in your eyes when anyone got too close, at the way you held yourself as if waiting for a blow, and I knew, my wolf's way would break you." He paused, and his next words were raw, vulnerable. "The thought of breaking you? It was like thinking of stopping my own heart." A tear slipped down her cheek, silent and hot on her cold skin. "So I asked him, my wolf, I asked him what you needed. He fought me. He snarled and paced and demanded I claim what was ours. But I held him back, and finally he answered. He showed me the cage around your wolf. It wasn't made of iron. It was made of fear, of ice. And you can't shatter a cage of ice with force. It only makes the shards sharper." He fell silent for a moment, and Sarah dared to open her eyes. She stared at the sliver of his boot she could see from her position on the floor. "It needed warmth," he whispered. "It needed to be melted, slowly. It needed joy. It needed to see that an alpha could be a fool instead of a tyrant, that power could be used for laughter instead of pain. that a king would gladly make himself a clown again and again and again if it meant he might one day earn a single, genuine smile from his queen. His queen. The words hung in the air, shimmering with a terrifying, beautiful promise. She finally found her voice, a broken, fragile thing. I can't. You don't have to do anything, he said immediately, his voice gentle but firm. You don't have to be my mate. You don't have to be my queen. The bond gives us a choice, Sarah. I have made mine. I choose you. You have every right to choose otherwise. I will not force you. I will never, never force you. He infused the word with the power of his alpha command, not as a weapon against her, but as a vow, a sacred, unbreakable alpha promise that the wolves of Ethermere called the blood oath, a commitment spoken with the full harmonic authority of the wolf, binding the alpha's own nature. To break it was to break one's own wolf. It was the heaviest vow a shifter could make. It settled deep in her bones not as a cage, but as a foundation, a safe place to stand. Slowly, painfully, she uncurled. She looked across the narrow aisle at him. He was just a man, sitting on the floor of a library, his ceremonial tunic rumpled, grass stains on his knees, his face open and honest and full of a love so fierce it was almost frightening. Through the bond, she could feel it, that love. It wasn't the hungry, consuming fire of the alpha who had owned her before. It was something steadier, something that wanted nothing from her except for her to be safe, to be whole. He hurt me, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. The alpha my father sold me to. He used the bond like a chain. He liked it when I cried. He hated it when I smiled. He said my smile wasn't for me to give. Dominic's jaw clenched and a low guttural growl rumbled in his chest. Through the bond, she felt his wolf surge, a blast of protective fury so intense it made the air shimmer. His golden eyes flashed to full wolf gold, his pupils contracting to slits. For one heartbeat, the alpha predator was fully visible, and it was not directing its rage at her. It was directing it at a dead man. His name, he bit out. He's dead, she said quietly. A border skirmish 5 years ago. She hesitated. But his brother holds the North March. His family still has power, and they still consider Omegas to be property. Something cold and precise settled behind Dominic's eyes, a king's calculation layered over a wolf's rage. That, he said softly, will be addressed. It wasn't a boast, it was a promise, spoken with the quiet certainty of a man who moved kingdoms. But he's not gone, she continued. She touched her temple. He lives in here. Then we will evict him, Dominic said, his voice soft again, but with an undercurrent of steel. We will fill this place with so much laughter, there is no room for his ghost. She watched him, this impossible, ridiculous, wonderful man. He had seen her brokenness, and instead of seeing a thing to conquer or discard, he had seen something worth healing. He hadn't tried to command her, or dominate her, or own her. He had tried to make her laugh. In a world that had only ever shown her the fist of an alpha, he had shown her the open, gentle, and sometimes clumsy hand. For 2 months, she said, her voice gaining a little strength. You've been making a fool of yourself for 2 months. A slow, sheepish grin spread across his face. My advisors were planning an intervention. Sirius was convinced I had brain fever. He was drafting contingency plans for a regency. A real watery chuckle escaped her. He asked me if I knew what was wrong with you. He thinks I'm doing something to you. You are, he said, and his voice dropped to that low, intimate register that made her skin tingle. You're making me better. He hesitated, then slowly, telegraphing the move, he reached a hand out across the space between them, palm up, an offering, not a demand. Sarah, let me show you. She stared at his hand. It was large and strong, calloused from sword practice and holding the reins of his warhorse. It was a hand that could crush and command, but it was also the hand that had fumbled with apples, that had been gentle with puppies, that was now offered to her in supplication. Through the bond she felt his fear. He was afraid. The king of Ethermere, whose wolf could face down a battalion, was terrified that she would say no. And he was letting her feel it. He was letting her see his vulnerability, freely and completely, because he understood that trust could not be demanded, it could only be given. Her own hand was trembling as she lifted it. This was the biggest risk of her life, more terrifying than facing down a snarling alpha, because this wasn't about survival. This was about choosing to live. Her fingers brushed against his. Through the bond, a jolt, pure and electric, shot between them, and she felt his wolf sigh, a vast, contented sound that vibrated through the golden cord connecting them. Her wolf answered with a tentative whine that became a soft, wondering purr. His fingers closed around hers, his grip firm but gentle, a promise of strength held in perfect restraint. He didn't pull her closer, he just held her hand, right there, on the dusty floor of her sanctuary. And through the bond, for the first time, she let herself feel what he was feeling. Not just his emotions, but his wolf's. It was lying at the edge of his consciousness, head on its paws, eyes half closed in a bliss so pure it made her throat ache. It wasn't celebrating a conquest, it was celebrating a homecoming. Its mate had come home. For the first time in 6 years, Sarah's wolf lay down. Not in submission, not in fear, in peace. Part 4. The Melting. The courtship of King Dominic and the Librarian. Sarah was, to the surprise of the entire court, a quiet affair. There were no grand proclamations, no lavish gifts of jewels or land. Instead, there were small, daily acts of gentle foolishness and the slow, careful construction of trust. He began to join her in the library. He didn't demand her attention. He would simply find the worn leather chair near where she was working, settle into it with a towering stack of books beside him that he claimed were essential for kingly matters. The first time, she was rigid, every nerve alight. She tracked his breathing, his movements, the quality of his scent, searching for the shift, the moment when the patience would crack and the real alpha would emerge. She knew how this worked. The gentleness was always a lure. The trap always came. But the trap never came. He read. He made notes in the margins of a trade proposal. He asked her with genuine interest whether she thought the tariff on northern wool was set too high, and then listened, actually listened, as she gave a 10-minute answer that drew on 3 different historical precedents. When she finished, breathless and flushed, embarrassed at having spoken so much, he looked at her with an expression of frank admiration. "You know more about this kingdom's economy than my entire Treasury Council," he said. She waited for the follow-up, the but, the "it's a shame you're just an Omega," the "this is why Omegas shouldn't fill their heads with books." "I'm bringing the wool tariff question to you next week," he said instead, and went back to his reading. Through the bond, she felt his wolf's contentment, a low, warm hum like a fire in a distant hearth. No agenda, no possession, just the simple pleasure of being near her. The second time he visited, he fell asleep. A weighty tome on agricultural reform resting on his chest, a soft snore rumbling from him. His face, asleep, lost all its kingly severity. He looked younger, the worry lines smoothed. His scent, usually so carefully controlled, went soft and unguarded, pure pine and warmth, with none of the dominant undertones. Sarah stood over him for a full minute, a spare blanket in her hands, engaged in the fiercest internal battle of her life. Her wolf wanted to curl up at his feet. Her old fear wanted to flee. Her rational mind was screaming that covering a sleeping king with a blanket was an intimacy she was not ready for. She covered him with a blanket. Then she went back to her work and found that the quiet sound of his breathing was the most comforting thing her library had ever contained. He learned to juggle, sort of. He practiced with rolled-up socks in the privacy of his chambers, and one evening he presented her with a passable, if wobbly, 3-sock cascade. She had laughed, a soft, easy sound that no longer frightened her, and he had beamed as if he'd just conquered a new territory. Through the bond, she felt the spike of his joy, fierce and bright, and realized with a start that her laughter affected him physically. His wolf responded to it the way other wolves responded to a full moon, with helpless, instinctive euphoria. He brought Captain Squawk to the library. The parrot, perched on a golden stand, was under strict orders to learn new phrases. Dominic would spend an hour a day patiently trying to teach the bird to say, "Sarah is the keeper of all wisdom," only for the parrot to shriek, "The king wears silly hats! Squawk!" This became a running joke between them, a shared secret in the quiet halls, and each time it happened, Sarah felt the bond between them strengthen, not with the heavy chains of obligation, but with the light, flexible threads of shared memory. He made her talk, not about her past, not about the darkness. He asked her about the books she loved. He would listen, utterly captivated, as she spoke for half an hour about the migration patterns of the northern iceworm, or the flawed poetic meter of a forgotten bard. Through the bond, she could feel his attention, not the sharp, evaluating focus of an alpha assessing a resource, but the warm, open attention of a man who found her fascinating. He made her feel that her thoughts, her knowledge, her voice mattered more than any royal decree. And slowly, he reintroduced touch. It started with him handing her a book, his fingers brushing hers for a second longer than necessary. Through the bond, she felt his wolf hold its breath each time, waiting to see if she would flinch. She did, the first few times. He never reacted. He never looked hurt or frustrated. He simply waited and tried again later. Then, a hand on her back to guide her through a doorway, always announced, "May I?" Always gentle. One day, as they walked in the garden, he simply took her hand. She tensed, the old fear a ghost at her shoulder, and through the bond she felt him register her tension and immediately loosen his grip, giving her the option to pull away. She didn't. His thumb traced a slow circle on the back of her hand, and her wolf sighed. They walked the entire length of the rose garden, hand in hand, and it felt less like a claiming and more like an anchoring. Her wolf, once a terrified prisoner, was transforming. It preened under the gentle, constant attention of his. It uncurled by the metaphorical hearth of his presence, feeling safe for the first time in its life. Her scent began to bloom, chamomile and old parchment growing richer by the day, and Dominic claimed it was the most beautiful perfume in the world. She could feel through the bond that he meant it with every fiber of his being. The court watched, baffled, and then, gradually, accepting. They saw their king, who had always been a bastion of strength and solemnity, now frequently smiling, his eyes always seeking out the quiet librarian. And they saw the librarian, the ghost of the palace, begin to gain color and substance. Her shoulders straightened, her head lifted, and sometimes, when she was looking at the king, she smiled. A radiant, breathtaking smile that transformed her face and seemed to light the very air around her. Lord Sirius approached Dominic 6 months after the affliction had begun. "Your Majesty," he began, his tone formal. "Sirius," Dominic greeted him warmly, a puppy, one of the 10, now a lanky adolescent approaching its first stirring, chewing contentedly on his boot. "I owe you an apology," the old advisor said, his gaze flicking to where Sarah was reading on a nearby bench, a small, peaceful smile on her face. "I believed you had lost your mind. I questioned the librarian. I drafted regency papers." He cleared his throat. "I see now you were merely finding your heart." Dominic's expression softened. "My dignity is a small price to pay for her happiness, my friend." "Indeed," Sirius said, a rare, genuine smile touching his own lips. "A kingdom is not built on dignity alone. It is built on strength. And I have never seen you stronger." Part 5. The Queen. The public claiming was not a ceremony of dominance, but of partnership. At the annual Harvest Ball, Dominic led Sarah onto the dance floor for the first dance. She wore a gown of deep sapphire blue that matched his tunic, and her dark hair was woven with small, star-like flowers he had picked for her himself. The mate mark, A ritual bite at the junction of neck and shoulder that would finalize the bond had been exchanged in private in the library, on the floor where he had first sat down across from her and let her choose. She had asked for it. He had wept when she did. As he took her in his arms on the dance floor, a hush fell over the great hall. Every wolf in the room could smell it, the completed bond, radiating from them like heat from a forge. 2 scents, pine and chamomile, woven together so tightly they were almost one. He didn't hold her possessively. He held her with a reverence that was far more powerful. He looked only at her, his golden eyes glowing with a love so profound it was a tangible force in the room. "Are you scared?" he murmured, his voice for her alone. She looked up at him, into the face of the man who had argued with a parrot and gotten buried under puppies for her. The man who had shown her that the strength of an alpha was not in his command, but in his restraint. The man who had seen her cage of ice and had not shattered it, but had patiently, ridiculously, melted it with the warmth of his own heart. The fear was still there. She would not pretend otherwise. It lived in a room at the back of her mind, a room that grew smaller each day but had not yet disappeared. Perhaps it never would entirely. But it no longer controlled her. It was a distant sound from a place she no longer lived, and she had filled the rest of her mind with so much light and laughter that the old darkness could not find a foothold. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady, and as the music began to swell, she leaned in and whispered in his ear, "But if you trip, I will not be held responsible for my actions." A rich, booming laugh escaped him, a sound of pure joy that echoed through the hall. He swung her into the dance, and as they moved together, a perfect synchronous pair, their wolves running in tandem beneath their skin, golden cord blazing between them, Sarah smiled. It was not the tentative, fragile smile of her healing. It was the free, radiant, uninhibited smile of a woman who was loved, a woman who was safe, a woman who was home. Later that night, they stood on the balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens. The distant sounds of the ball were a soft murmur behind them. Dominic wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his warmth, her head resting on his shoulder, utterly content. Through the bond, their wolves lay together, entwined, a single creature with 2 hearts. "I have a confession," he said quietly into her hair. "Oh?" she asked, a playful note in her voice. "Did you bribe Captain Squawk with extra crackers?" "Worse," he said, his tone mock serious. "The fountain. The rubber duck." She turned in his arms to face him, a questioning look in her eyes. He had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "I didn't fall in by accident." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. "My Lord King," she said, her voice full of laughter, "after 2 months of your relentless, ridiculous campaign, I would have been deeply disappointed if you had." He grinned, pulling her closer. "I was running out of ideas. The puppies were my ace in the hole. The fountain was a last resort." "It was a masterpiece," she assured him, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertip. "A symphony of foolishness." "All for you," he murmured, his expression turning serious, his golden eyes searching hers. "Always. Was it worth it? The loss of my fearsome reputation?" Sarah's smile softened. She thought of the ghost in the library, the woman who had lived in the shadows, her heart frozen with fear. She thought of the cage of ice, now just a puddle of forgotten water. She thought of the sound of her own laughter, a sound she now heard every day. She rose on her toes and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his lips. A kiss of promise, of gratitude, of a love that had been born not in a fiery claiming, but in a quiet, steady, and utterly absurd courtship. "Dominic," she whispered against his mouth, "your foolishness didn't just earn my smile. It saved my soul." He held her then, not as a king holding his queen, but as a man holding his entire world. The scent of pine and frost enveloped her, no longer a threat, but a promise of safety, a promise of home. And through the bond, she felt his wolf settle, vast and powerful and utterly at peace. because its mate, its beautiful, smiling mate, was finally happy. And in the end, that was the only victory that had ever mattered.